Hello, happy Friday. Here we are for our 31st automation hour, and I am here with David Litton and Rakesh Gupta and our guest speaker, Meighan Brodkey. So for those who are joining us for the first time, we do have all lines muted. Please use the chat function to ask questions about Meighan's presentation as she goes through it, or about any general process automation questions. And we will try to get to your questions during the call. If we don't, we will continue our discussion on the Trailblazer community. After the session, we will be posting the recording as well as the deck on Automation Hour and our Trailblazer community Salesforce Automation Hour, and we will communicate as well via Twitter. So this is actually the last session in our intermediate series. And then in 2 weeks, we will start our advanced series with Sarah Martin, end the year with Brian Kwong, and then go into January with Doug and Francis. So pretty shortly, we will be scheduling out the additional sessions for into 2018. I can't even believe I'm saying that. So if you are out there and you have a cool use case and process automation solution, go to automationhour.com and submit your idea, and we will reach out to you, and you could present that to the Salesforce community. We definitely want to reach out and acknowledge Concrete.io for supporting this webinar series and bringing it to everyone for free. And with that, here are your co-hosts, David, myself, and Rakesh. This was before Mark Benioff's keynote at Dreamforce. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Meighan. This is her second time back. We're excited to have her, and I'm excited to see what she has to share with us. So let me turn it over to Meighan.
Awesome. And do the show my screen button. There we go. Awesome. Hi. So I'm Meighan Brodkey. I'm a technical architect at Sunreach Consulting, and I'm also the Seattle Women in Tech user group leader. I've been working with Salesforce for about 10 years now. Started as a customer success manager, became an administrator, started to get into coding and development, and then I became a TA. And I am a huge lover of visual workflow. One thing that I love about it is the fact that I didn't realize what a dangerous developer I really was until I started using it. And it made so much click for me as I moved forward and started to get more into development by having visual workflow available and seeing how things connected and just starting to think in that type of way. And so I'm so excited to be able to share that with you guys. And so the use case today that I'm going to be talking about are Rollup Summary Fields with Lookup, and specifically looking at having two objects that are related to each other via a lookup field, such as you have a parent and a child that are the same object. You can't have a master detail in that situation, so you'd have to use a lookup. But you still want to have the totals from the child object summed up onto the parent. And to add a little bit of an additional layer to this, to filter those summary fields. So based on what type of value and what category they fall into, to determine whether or not they would actually apply to certain total values. And so adding the same type of filter power that you have with Rollup Summary Fields to doing that within your flow. And so to go over everything, it's going to be starting with going over the automation and then the configuration. And then I'll be going into the actual process and flow and walking you through those steps individually. And then we'll do a demo. And then after that, we'll have Q&A. And so one of the big things that you have to think about is your data and the way that things are going to be structured. And so in this example, like I said, I'm using a custom object and I have it related to a parent record of that same object using a lookup field. And so we then went in and created currency fields that would hold the total amounts that are going to be rolling up from those child records onto the parent. Then we needed to create a process. The process was to make it so that we could actually have the flow kick off. And so the process is going to be used to launch the flow as well as to determine whether or not it meets the criteria. And then we have the visual workflow in which we're going to be going through fast lookups so that we can find all of those related child records. We're going to be looping through those and finding out whether or not they apply based on the values on their fields, and then assigning those values to variables within the flow, and then putting them back into the collection, then going in and doing collections, and then doing the update of the parent record at the end. And so master detail versus lookup. The example I am using is using the same object, but there are times when you're going to want to use a lookup field to relate two different objects instead of a master detail, rather than just have it on the same object. When you use a master detail relationship, you're then saying that that record is going to be owned by that other, the owner of the parent record. And so now you have that tied with the actual visibility and ownership of the record. And that's not always something that you want to do. Sometimes you want to have those records owned by other people. It also affects your sharing and whether or not records are going to be visible to other people because of that ownership. And so those are situations in which, you know, if you are going to need to have things that go different than your regular sharing settings, or you're going to need to have owners of those other records that may not be the owners of the parents, you may want to look at using a lookup rather than a master detail in that situation. Okay, so how everything is connected. So to give you a little bit of background on this, so this org actually has the nonprofit starter pack installed. And with that, you're able to have your opportunities, which are used to track things like donations and money that's given to a nonprofit. Along with that, you have your general accounting unit allocation. This is where you can, with like nonprofits, they have certain opportunities where X amount of the opportunity money needs to be used for this type of program, or it needs to be used for this specific cost. And that's what the GIU allocation does. And so this record is actually connecting that opportunity to the general accounting unit. And so it's that junction object in between the two where you have a lookup relationship. And that's where you're going to have all of your totals that are coming from the opportunity that we're going to want to total onto the general accounting unit. We're adding the additional layer by having this general accounting unit then roll up to a parent record. And I have two different we have different record types here. We have the default and we have the parent. And that's what we're going to be using in the flow to determine whether or not we're going to be looking at the regular parent or the top level parent. We're going to have the totals from all of the lower level general accounting units. We're also going to be using this category field here to be determining whether or not we want to total up these numbers, which came from those GIU allocation records, if we want to total those numbers onto the parent record, and if so, where. Trust me, it's going to make a lot more sense when we actually look at the flow and break this down one at a time. But to go over the automation, like I said, the process is going to be based on the GIU allocation, and it's for whenever a record is created or edited. In this example, we're using the opportunity stage as a determining factor in whether or not these GIU allocation records should be counted as a pledged fund, or if they should be counted as something that's been awarded and completed. And so that's whether or not it's pretty much closed won, or if it's something that is about to be closed won. And so by doing that, we need to make sure that when that update happens, that it's actually going to update the record. So we don't want to use a formula field. We're going to use the process to actually set that value for the opportunity stage. And then we have a second action in which we're going to be launching that flow. And that is based on when the amounts are pledged or if they've been awarded. Any other opportunity stage doesn't matter. Those are just the two that we're concerned about. And this is where we have our first flow. And this is where we're just doing the sum of the pledged amounts versus the awarded amounts. And this is what goes onto that default record type I mentioned before. And from here, that's going to have the GIU updated. And then because the record was updated, we then have it so that the parent record has a flow as well for it to be updated too. And it's going to check if it's the regular parent or the top level parent, and then determine whether or not it should be doing just the default totals, or if we're going to be breaking it down and doing that categorization for whether or not it applies to the top level. And so I'm actually going to jump over into Salesforce here to show you an example. And so this is an opportunity record that's been created. It's for $37,224, and it's connected to this GIU allocation record. This is what I was mentioning before, is the junction object between the opportunity and the general accounting unit. And so this is going to hold the amount here, and we want to have that total roll up onto the general accounting unit. We always want to have the default records to have all of the allocations totaled on them. It's not until we get to the higher levels that we're actually concerned with the filtering. And so you'll notice here that next to on the Rockefeller Center record, we actually have a parent record, and that parent is then connected to the total organization. And we have different values that are on these records. You'll notice that here we have the budget goal and hierarchy versus where we just had the budget goal previously on that default record. And so those different fields are holding different values for different reporting purposes, for them to make it easier rather than just doing the totals into the same field. And to take a look at that process we have, this is where we have the no criteria for what's going on when the general allocation is updated. And then we'll be launching the flow by passing over that GIU field. And so when we look at it, this is the general accounting unit, and that's the field we want to pass over, since that's where we want to get our totals, we want to send our totals to. And then we go into our flow where it goes in, and it just does a standard record lookup. You're only going to have one parent since it's just a single lookup field. So we'd use the standard record lookup rather than a fast lookup. And we just use that ID that was passed over previously, and then we're able to collect the different values that we're going to need for the ID, the prospective allocations, the total allocations, and then having that record type. The next thing that we want to do is we want to find all of those child records that roll up to that general accounting unit. We had the one that was edited, and so we need to change all of the totals that are on that parent. And to determine what those values should be, we'll need to do a sum of all of the child records. And so we want to make sure that the amount is greater than 0 for the records we're grabbing in this situation. And then we want to make sure that they have that general accounting unit field with the same parent. And we collect the opportunity stage, the amount, and the ID. And the stage is going to help us determine, once we go into our looping through the allocations, whether or not the amount is pledged or if it's awarded. And that's based on that opportunity stage. And depending on which value it is, we then go into the assignment variables. And if it's awarded, it'll then be added to the total allocations amount. And if it's something that's pledged, it's added to the total pledged amount. Once the loop is done, we go in and we'll go into that parent record, and with a single record update rather than a fast update, because again, we're just updating a single record, we'll go and update the fields for the total amount pledged and the total allocations amount. And that's how we'll end up getting the values onto the default record. We then have the other flow where we have a record lookup that's done first. And we want to find out what the record type name is. And we check to find out, is it a default record type or is it a parent that's been updated? So the other flow is updating the record, which is going to cause the record to update, which then triggers the which will trigger the other flow to then to launch. That's the word I'm looking for. And it'll go through, and if it's a default record, we'll want to go and find out, just do the summaries onto the parent. But if it's a parent record that's been updated, then we end up wanting to do that top level where we have all that categorization done. And so we go through the different paths. And so if it's the default, we'll do a fast lookup of all of the other default record types. So that would be anything that is a general accounting unit with the same parent. There's actually a validation rule to make sure that the parent record or the default records only have parents that they roll up to for the record type. So we just check for that parent GIU ID, and we want to collect those fields. And again, the fields we're collecting on the parent and on the child are different. So another reason why we want to make sure to do the lookup separately. And here's where we're going to be collecting that budget goal, the category, prospective allocations, total allocations, and going through and looping through those children, and then just adding up the default amounts. And these will all just go into the total default for the child, budget goal, allocations, and pledge. And after that's done, we go in and we're updating the record that had that parent ID, that had the ID that matches the parent ID from our previous record. And since we're updating the parent, we always want to update those fields that relate to the in hierarchy. So we have the budget goal in hierarchy. We have, expected revenue. Specifically, this one looks at special projects, which is assigned on the other side. Then we have our prospective allocation, and then the confirmed allocations, which is the total allocation. The record type would have been for the parent. We're going to do the same thing we were doing before with the fast lookup and the loop. But you'll notice we have another decision that's in there. And this is where we're checking out what that category is. And we want to find out, if it's special projects, we had that field for the special projects amount. And so we want to make sure that that amount is going to get populated there rather than getting counted in the total allocation. And so that's why we have the separate decision where these two totals are separate from the standard categories. And if they do have the default, any of the other categories, then they would go through the default path. But we go through and then we're adding those values to the variables that are specific to that actual category's total amounts. And so we have those being added in, calling out the new parks as well as the special parks, and then our default. Everything goes back into that loop. And again, it goes back to that same record update. Since we're updating the exact same fields for both the parent and that top level parent, what we're able to do then is to have it so that we can have that single record update to do the total. And to go in and create an opportunity is the first step for the demo. And so we'll do donation as and it's a test account. And for the amount, we'll do $10,000. And setting our stage to active awarded. The next thing we need to do is we need to create that GIU allocation record that's going to connect this to the actual general accounting unit where we're going to hold those totals. And so that's where we go in. And we are going to pick the Rockefeller Center example and do the $10,000. And then we'll hit save. And when we go over to the Rockefeller Center, you'll notice that we now have the automation hour demo added to here. You have the option to add in the percentage, or you can add in the amount. It's optional for you to go either way. And then if you enter the percent, it would calculate the amount, but it's not a required field, which is why these two do not have it. And if we take a look at the Rockefeller Center, previously we had the, I refreshed the page. And so we had the workflow fire so that we have the amount going up And then we have the totals that are being added up onto the parent. And because of the fact that this was part of the park budget, which wasn't one of those special called out types of totals, our values are going into these standard fields rather than going into that special projects field. And then on the top level, you'll notice that that top level parent has the totals on it as well. And below it, we'll have that park budget, which has the Rockefeller Center below it that is connected to the GIU allocation, that is connected to the opportunity that we created. One thing with this flow that we ended up having a couple of problems with when we originally built it was multi-currency. And so one thing that I'd like to warn you about a little bit when using flow is that multi-currency and totals, the numbers were coming up to be dramatically different than anything that would be expected. And then also making sure that we had consistency of what type of currency would we be using so that we could make sure that things would be added up properly. Luckily, it was just historic records that were being affected, so we were able to work around that. And then also making sure that when you're creating your flows, that you actually go in and for your variables to have your default values set. When you are creating the flow and you're trying to figure out whether or not it's firing and whether or not your totals are coming up correctly, having a blank field isn't as helpful as knowing that it has the 0 that was the default. And so you're able to find out whether or not it even had the default value assigned, and if it got to that point in the flow, or if the flow wasn't even firing, and that's why we have the blank fields as well. And so that's just something to keep in mind. To always set when you're going through, especially if you're using rollup summaries, to have that default set on each one of your variables that are for the amounts or numbers. I know it's a bunch of stuff and it was a bunch of talking in circles, but so far, any parts that you want me to dig into a little bit more or any questions? Oh, to check out, oh, sorry.
That's right. So I was just going to say, Marco has a comment. It'd be interesting to see the ERD schema builder of the objects that were covered, opportunity, GIU allocation, etc.
Absolutely. So we had the GIU allocation, the general accounting unit, and then we had the opportunity. And I always showed it more organized. Just do. So this is how the objects are connected to each other. And then it's the general accounting unit itself that has the 3 layers based on the record type. So your opportunity and general accounting unit are connected to that GIU allocation. And then the total amounts sit on the general accounting unit. The reason that we don't go directly from the opportunity to the general accounting unit is, again, because you can have the amounts that you win in opportunity designated to multiple places. So by having the GIU allocation, you're able to decide 50% goes to Rockefeller Center and 50% goes to, National Beach Park or Olympic National Park, and have it set up that way so that you're able to have those funds divided rather than having to do multiple opportunities for a single donation.
All right. Rob has a question. How did you handle multi-currency?
So we insist, they went forward with using only USD on the GIU allocations. And so even if their opportunities had an amount that may have been in euros, they would be handling the GIU allocations in USD. I'm not sure, Jen, have you done much with multi-currency and flows and had any other advice for that?
The orgs that I've worked on have only been United States dollars. I don't know, Rakesh or David, if you have experience with that.
No, I don't. So I can't provide too much value there.
Yeah,
right.
So we just made it a business practice to force them to use USD on allocations. It'd be great to find out if there is a way to be able to work better with multi-currency and flow. So if anyone has any tips for that, I'm totally open to hearing them.
Okay, Mark asks, is this bulkified? And if you were to update many via data loader, would it still work?
So this process does allow for them to do the mass imports of their GIU allocations and general accounting units. We were able to mass load those. So since we didn't have any errors, I'm assuming it's bulkified. Yeah.
Okay, and Rob's question, what if an error occurs? And I don't know if that is tied to anything previously or just a general question.
Oh, one thing that I didn't put into this flow that I usually do in flows is when we do have things such as the decision, to jump back over, where you do have the option of the default outcome, I usually end up putting in a custom email message that goes to a constant and using that constant to hold whatever the comma separated values are for the email addresses that should receive the error. I didn't actually build that into this flow, but that is something that I recommend doing just because those flow error messages are kind of difficult to read. And going through the debug log isn't as fun as it sounds.
Okay, I don't see any other questions unless folks are typing madly and haven't submitted yet.
I think that the biggest part that we were having errors with, to kind of go back to the bulk authentication, was actually getting it so that we could do that mass import of records. There were times in which when we originally built this, that we had to make changes to how we had it structured for when we're doing fast lookups and how we have just the order in which we have the records updated, because we were getting errors and we were having problems where we could only insert, 20 records at a time. And so we've gone through a number of iterations to make it so that we have been able to do the mass imports with the data loader. But that was definitely something that came up during the build that was pretty frustrating part of the process.
There is a question about the chart that was displayed and whether it's tied to the rollup category results.
Which part?
I think it was it on the opportunity or on one of the?
Yeah. So we have on the general accounting unit, we have the category field. And is that what you're talking? Is that what's being referenced? And how it affects the rollup summaries?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So the category here is held on the default level. And to give you a little bit more info about the data model. So the top level parent, that one doesn't actually have a category associated with it, which is why we need to have those values separated out on that top level parent. But our regular parents, that middle level, they do have the category associated. And all of their children are going to be of that same category. But their siblings are going to be of the different categories. And so we're using that category field when the record type is parent, and we're going in to make that update so that we can have it so that the different children that are on that parent level, and so therefore what the values are for all of the grandchildren and all of their GIU allocation records. That's dividing it up here in that top level parent for the totals, where we're checking to say, is the category special projects, is it new parks, or is it anything else? And that'll decide whether or not on that top level parent we update that special parks total, there's a new parks total, and then we have the standard fields that were on there that are going to be updated by all of the other categories. So that's where the category field really comes into play, is on the top level parent. And the way that we made sure that we were going to have it so that the totals did add up correctly, and that we didn't have to do that weird filtering on every level just to make sure that we didn't have, oh, they accidentally attached a new parks record to special projects record, is going through and making sure we had a validation rule that says your category has to match your parent's category when you have the record type of default. So that was a long, long explanation to that. Did that make sense?
You got a 10-4 for that.
Awesome. All right. Oh. Any other general process-related questions or flow-related questions, maybe not specifically related to the multi-level lookup summary totals?
I don't see any so far, but if we give folks like a minute or two, maybe someone might come up with one.
Awesome.
Randy asks, are there any DML limits? Hi, Randy.
We were able to do bulk imports and use the data loader, Randy. Hi, thank you so much for coming, by the way, here. Yeah, I mean, when building your flow, it's one thing that you definitely want to keep in mind. And when doing things like going through loops and making sure that you're not doing, you know, random record updates in the middle of your loops, and making sure you're assigning things to variables and doing a mass update at the end. So you're still held to the same limits that you are when doing anything else in Salesforce, to answer your question after that long drawn out answer.
Rob asks, any issues with record update concurrently, like record locking?
So we haven't actually experienced any of it, and the client, the way that we did the build for them, they don't actually have that many records that they're updating on a regular basis. Or that they're creating on a regular basis. They're updating them, but usually things are getting updated based on when, you know, you have an opportunity that's either going into that pledged or awarded stage. So things are really being updated on those one-off bases. But even when we were doing our testing and doing the mass imports to create the records originally, after we had installed the nonprofit success starter pack, we were able to do those installs or those imports without having anything freeze up or give us any errors regarding the fact that, oh, you're trying to update this record, but this record is trying to be updated, or, you know, trying to update the same parent because of the multiple children. We didn't run into any problems. And so there wasn't anything we found in testing, but it is something that was definitely being watched for.
Okay, Randy has another question. Pros and cons on using flow versus RUH or declarative rollups for this type of scenario?
I mean, if you're able to go with a package that's something that's been created, that's able to be regularly maintained by a partner with updates, so that you're going to be able to have those cool options. I like using the declarative rollup summaries app. I think it's awesome. But in this case, the budget wasn't something that they were able to do, and they needed more than those 3 fields that they were given with the free version. So that's the reason why we ended up going with the flow. Other than that, I mean, do you guys have any input on that one?
So I know it, what was it, True to the Core, they mentioned Andrew Fawcett's, I always forget how to say it, but his Rollup helper, that's the package as well that you can install. So I like using that one a lot, but there's other scenarios where I find the flow a little bit easier. So it kind of depends. I think with what you kind of demoed here, there's a lot of kind of different logic that's going off of based off of what kind of record it is. And this is a good kind of place to show that, while you probably could make it work with one of those other ones. This kind of puts it all into one concise area for you to control the logic. So I think there's pros and cons with all of them, but I definitely use both scenarios. Probably use Andrew Faucet's the most.
Yeah, I've installed that in a few different orgs for a few different clients, and I have it in my own dev org to play with as well. So it's one of those where it really depends on the situation. I would definitely agree with you there.
Okay, any other questions out there? I'm not seeing any more come through. All right, I think that's it. I don't see any other questions coming in, Megan. So I want to definitely thank you for coming back on to do a second presentation, and hopefully you'll come back on many other times as well. So good job on this presentation. I learned new things from this.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you for everyone that attended.
All right. Thank you, and we'll talk to you at our next automation hour.
Thanks, everybody.